Somewhere beneath the parking lots and highways of St. Louis, Missouri, under the concrete and the rebar and the buried utility lines, there is a city that the official history has almost entirely forgotten. Not the French colonial city, not the 19th century trading post, not the gateway to the American West, something older, something that was still standing, still visible, still documented on city surveys and newspaper front pages until the 1860s. 26 earthen mounds, each one massive, each one deliberately constructed, each one aligned with the others in a pattern that engineers and surveyors of the era found deeply strange, and every single one of them was gone by 1869. Not relocated, not preserved, not studied and then demolished with reluctant necessity. Just gone, leveled, scraped into the Mississippi River and into the foundations of a city that needed the land and did not want to ask too many questions about what had. I have to pause here for a second, because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. The city was called Mound City before it was called St. Louis. That name appears in early 19th century documents, in traveller accounts, in newspaper articles, in the private correspondence of men who visited the site and could not quite believe what they were looking at. The mounds defined the place. They were the skyline before there was a skyline. They were the first thing you saw approaching from the river. And the people who built them have been assigned a name in the textbooks, the Mississippian culture, and a timeline, roughly 600 to 1400 AD, and a modest set of capabilities, agricultural societies with religious traditions involving earthen ceremonial structures. That is the official story. And like so many official stories about this particular era of American history, it leaves out almost everything interesting. It leaves out the scale of what was actually there. It leaves out how fast it was destroyed. It leaves out who specifically ordered the destruction, who funded it, and who stood to gain from erasing the most spectacular archaeological site in the history of the North American continent. And it leaves out the pattern. The same pattern that runs through the vanished world fairs, through the levelled architecture of a dozen American cities, through the redrawn maps and the redated buildings and the institutional decisions to stop asking certain questions about what was standing on this land before the people the textbooks recognize arrived. Tonight we go through every piece of that story. We go through the mounds themselves, their dimensions and their alignments, and the things the early surveyors wrote about them that never made it into the standard historical record. We go through the economics of their destruction, who owned the land, who developed it, and what the city of St. Louis became immediately after the mounds were levelled. And we ask the question that should have been asked 150 years ago and has been avoided with remarkable consistency ever since. What was actually there? And why was it so important to make sure nobody could ever go back and look? To understand what St. Louis looked like in 1800, before the demolition began in earnest, you have to read the accounts of the men who were actually there, not the textbooks written a century later, the primary sources, the journals, the letters, the survey reports, because what those men described was not a scattering of modest ceremonial bumps in the earth. What they described was a complex, an organized, deliberate, geometrically sophisticated arrangement of massive earthen structures covering several square miles of riverfront land at the exact point where the Missouri River and the Mississippi River converge. Henry Marie Brackenridge was a lawyer and writer who visited St. Louis in 1811. He was careful with his language, precise in his descriptions, and skeptical of sensationalism. And he wrote the following: "I was struck with astonishment by the mounds. If the city of Philadelphia and its environs were deserted, there would not be more numerous traces of human habitation." He was comparing what he saw on the west bank of the Mississippi to one of the largest and most densely inhabited cities in the United States at the time. That is not a metaphor. That is a measurement. A trained observer standing in front of something and saying the sheer density of monumental construction here is equivalent to a major American city. John Bradbury, a Scottish botanist visiting the same year, wrote that the mounds were arranged with such regularity that it was difficult to believe they had not been laid out by people who understood geometry. He noted that several of the largest mounds were aligned in ways that corresponded to compass directions, with a precision he found difficult to attribute to a society without instruments. Two independent observers, arriving separately, reaching the same conclusion. Whatever was standing on that riverfront in 1811 did not look accidental to the people trained to recognize the difference. The largest of the St. Louis mounds was called the Great Mound. It stood approximately 30 feet high and covered roughly half an acre at its base. That is 30 feet of deliberately moved earth, compacted, shaped, and maintained over a period that the standard archaeological timeline puts at several centuries. To move that earth with no mechanized assistance, using only baskets and human backs, would require a labor force of significant size, organized over a significant period of time, directed by someone capable of coordinating sustained collective effort toward a single geometric goal. 12 miles away, across the Mississippi in what is now Collinsville, Illinois, sat Monk's Mound, the central structure of the Cahokia Mounds complex. Monk's Mound covers 14 acres at its base. It rises in 4 terraces to a height of 100 feet. The total volume of moved earth in that single structure exceeds the volume of the Great Pyramid of Giza. By volume, Monk's Mound is the largest pyramid in the Western Hemisphere. It still stands today, protected by state and federal preservation status. Monk's Mound and the 26 mounds of St. Louis were not separate sites. They were components of a single system, a city complex that stretched across both banks of the Mississippi, interconnected by geography, aligned to the same astronomical and geometric principles, built by the same hands over the same period, and designed to function as a unified whole. The ancient city of Cahokia, at its peak around 1050 to 1150 AD, according to the standard timeline, had a population estimated at between 10,000 and 20,000 people. That would have made it one of the largest cities in the world at that time, larger than London in that era, comparable to Paris. A city of 20,000 people in North America, at a moment when European civilization had not yet contemplated crossing the Atlantic. That is what the official story acknowledges. And still, even with that acknowledgement, the destruction of the St. Louis mounds is treated as a regrettable but understandable consequence of urban development. Growth happened, land was needed, the mounds were in the way, but the story does not account for the speed. It does not account for the deliberateness, and it does not account for what was found inside the mounds when they were finally opened in a rush, before the earth-moving equipment arrived. The mounds at St. Louis were opened, excavated, and destroyed in a window of roughly 15 years, between approximately 1853 and 1869. This was not a slow, gradual process of urban encroachment. This was an organized demolition campaign. City engineers were involved, land speculators were involved, the city government was involved, and the archaeologists and scientists who begged for more time to study the structures before they were gone were consistently overruled. Charles Rau was a German immigrant and self-trained archaeologist who was documenting the St. Louis mounds in the 1860s, working in cooperation with the Smithsonian Institution. He wrote letters, he filed reports, he pleaded with city officials to slow the demolition long enough to allow proper scientific investigation. His correspondence, preserved in the Smithsonian archives, is a record of a man watching something irreplaceable disappear faster than he can document it. He wrote that he was finding artifacts inside the mounds that he could not categorize using existing frameworks. He described ceramic vessels with geometric markings he had not seen in any published collection. He described copper ornaments of a workmanship that seemed inconsistent with the primitive tool-making assumed for these cultures. He described evidence of organized internal chambers, of stratified deposits that suggested repeated use and modification over a very long period of time. And then the earth movers arrived, and the mounds were gone, and whatever Rau could not carry out in his arms was buried under the foundations of a railroad yard. The railroad is the key to the economics of the destruction. St. Louis in the 1850s was not just growing, it was being positioned as the central hub of the American transcontinental railroad network. The city sat at the confluence of the Missouri and Mississippi rivers, the two great inland waterways of the continent. Whoever controlled St. Louis controlled the movement of goods from the entire interior of North America. The railroad developers, the land speculators, the investment banks, all of them wanted the St. Louis riverfront cleared, leveled, buildable. The 26 mounds sat on prime riverfront real estate. The earth from those mounds had immediate practical value. It could be used as fill for low-lying areas along the waterfront. It could be used to grade the rail yards. It could be used to pack the foundations of warehouses and industrial buildings. In demolishing the mounds, the developers were not just clearing an obstacle. They were harvesting a resource. The sacred and the scientific were both inconvenient, and the economic argument won absolutely. The first major mound to be deliberately demolished was a structure called the Big Mound, the largest of the St. Louis complex, standing near what is now Broadway and Mound Street. The demolition began in 1869 and took approximately 4 months. The earth was loaded into wagons and used to fill in the north part of the city. Contemporary newspaper accounts describe the demolition in a tone that mixes mild regret with enthusiastic approval. One article notes that the old mound, relic of a vanished race, is finally yielding to the march of progress. The language is telling. Vanished race. The question of who built the mounds and when and why was not answered. It was bypassed with a phrase, "A vanished race built them. They are gone. We do not need to know more." When the Big Mound was opened during demolition, workers discovered a series of stone crypts in its interior. These were not simple burial pits. They were lined chambers constructed with flat stones fitted together without mortar, forming rectangular rooms of deliberate and consistent dimensions. Inside these chambers were human remains. The skeletons were described by witnesses as being of unusual size. The newspaper accounts describe bones of people significantly larger than the workers doing the digging. Some accounts mention skulls of unusual shape. The workers and the engineers who saw these remains did not agree on what they were looking at, but they agreed that it was not what they expected. And within weeks the chambers were gone, packed into the same wagons carrying the rest of the mound into the streets of a growing city. The alternative history community has spent decades on this thread, the reports of unusual skeletal remains found inside North American earthen mounds. The official archaeological position is that these reports are exaggerated, misidentified, or fabricated. It is also worth noting that the Smithsonian Institution, which received many of the artifacts and some of the bone material from the St. Louis demolitions, has published remarkably little about the contents of the St. Louis mounds compared to the volume of material that was reportedly recovered. What the Smithsonian has published shows a collection of copper, ceramic, shell, and stone artifacts consistent with the Mississippian cultural framework. These are valuable archaeological objects. They are also the objects that fit comfortably within the existing narrative. The objects that do not fit, the ones Rao described as inconsistent with existing frameworks, the unusual workmanship, the unclassified geometric markings, these do not appear in the published Smithsonian reports with the same regularity that Rao's correspondence suggests they should. Across the Mississippi Valley, from St. Louis to Natchez, from Cahokia to the Tennessee Valley, the earthen mound complexes that were not preserved were systematically demolished in the same 2-decade window between roughly 1850 and 1870, the same era of railroad expansion, the same era of industrial land development, the same era when the United States was building the infrastructure of a continental economy and needed every piece of level, centrally located land it could get. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. The question the Tartarian framework raises is not simply whether this destruction was economically motivated. It obviously was. The question is whether the economic motivation was the complete explanation, or whether there was a second motivation operating alongside it. A motivation to ensure that the physical evidence of whatever had previously occupied this land was not available to be studied, analysed and compared to other structures being simultaneously demolished across the globe. Because the same window of time that saw the levelling of the St. Louis mounds also saw the redevelopment of enormous sections of Paris, the demolition of entire medieval neighbourhoods in London to make way for railway terminals, the reordering of American cities from New Orleans to Chicago. The world fairs that followed in the 1870s, 1880s and 1890s would present gleaming new cities to an admiring public as evidence of industrial progress. What they would not present was the careful documentation of what those cities had been built on top of. The old was gone, and the new was photographed and celebrated, and the gap between the two was filled with the phrase "marching progress," and left at that. The astronomical alignments of the Cahokia and St. Louis mound complexes are among the most difficult aspects to explain using the simple Mississippian agricultural community model. Monk's Mound is oriented to true north with an accuracy of within a fraction of a degree. Warren Woodhenge, a series of red cedar post circles discovered adjacent to the mound complex, is an astronomical calendar of significant sophistication. The posts were positioned to mark the sunrise positions at the solstices and equinoxes with precision that required repeated observation and mathematical calculation across generations. The people who built these structures were not guessing at the sky, they were measuring it. They had committed the movements of celestial bodies to physical form in a landscape that, once properly read, functions as a calendar, a compass, and a cosmological statement all at once. Thomas Say, a naturalist who examined the St. Louis site in the early 19th century, wrote that the mounds seemed to him to be placed with reference to each other and to the river in a manner suggesting an overall design, as if whoever placed them had a map of the whole in mind before placing any individual piece. A map of the whole before placing any individual piece. That is the description of urban planning. That is the description of a civilization that thought in systems rather than in isolated structures. The alternative history researchers working within the Tartarian framework argue that the organizational sophistication visible in the mound complexes, the astronomical precision, the geometric planning, the scale of coordinated labor, is more consistent with the remnants of a much older and more technologically advanced civilization than with a pre-agricultural society spontaneously developing monument building in the centuries between 600 and 1200 AD. They argue that the mounds are not the pinnacle of Mississippian achievement. They are the surviving fragments of something that came before, something that was already in decline when the Mississippian people inherited the landscape and began maintaining structures that had originally been built by a civilization the standard timeline does not acknowledge. The best evidence, the contents of the mounds themselves, was destroyed. The bones, the artifacts, the stratified deposits that could have allowed detailed dating and analysis were bulldozed into railroad fill in 1869. What remains is what was salvaged in a hurry by underfunded scientists working against deadline, and what can be inferred from the surviving structures at Cahokia and from the written accounts of men who saw St. Louis before the levelling began. In 1877, the Bureau of American Ethnology was established as part of the Smithsonian Institution, tasked specifically with studying the native peoples of North America. The resulting publication, Mound Explorations by Cyrus Thomas, published in 1894, concluded that the mounds had been built by the ancestors of the Native American peoples living in the region at the time of European contact. This directly refuted the mound builder myth, which held that the mounds had been constructed by a vanished superior race of non-indigenous people. Thomas was right to refute the racist version of this theory. The mound builder myth was used to justify the dispossession of Native Americans by arguing that they had no ancestral connection to the landscape they occupied. But in refuting the racist myth, the Bureau also shut down a broader line of inquiry. The choice was framed as binary. Either the mounds were built by a lost superior race, which was racist and wrong, or they were built by simple indigenous agricultural societies. The third option, that the mounds were built by a sophisticated prehistorical civilization whose descendants include, but are not limited to, the people Europeans encountered at contact, was never seriously developed. This is the intellectual trap that the Tartarian framework is trying to break out of, not by reviving the 19th century racist theory, but by insisting that the sophistication visible in the mound complexes requires a more complete explanation than the standard model provides. The question of how sophisticated these builders were, and whether they were working within a tradition that extended further back in time than the current timeline acknowledges, is not a racist question. It is a scientific one, and the science cannot be done on structures that have been levelled and carted away. The city of St. Louis became the fourth largest city in the United States by 1870, the year after the last major mounds were destroyed. The removal of the mounds and the explosion of St. Louis as a major American city are not two separate events. They are the same event. The mounds came down, the city went up. The railroad yards were graded with the earth of the demolished monuments. The prosperity of industrial St. Louis was literally built on top of the erased evidence of whatever had been there before. The choice of St. Louis as the site of the 1904 World's Fair is worth noting. Here, 35 years after the last mound was destroyed, the city that had been called Mound City hosted one of the most spectacular world fairs in American history, celebrating the centennial of the Louisiana Purchase, which was the transaction by which the United States had acquired the entire interior of the continent, including the land on which the mounds had stood. The fair attracted 20 million visitors, and it was, almost entirely, demolished afterward. The temporary city vanished as completely as the mounds had vanished in a pattern the Tartarian researchers read as deliberate and repeated. Build the spectacular, then erase it. Construct the official history over the erasure and invite the world to celebrate what has been built, without ever mentioning what was destroyed to clear the ground. Today, the only surviving indication of what was once there is a street, Mound Street, running through the part of St. Louis that once contained the complex. No mounds remain, no markers explain what was there, no museum in St. Louis is dedicated specifically to the mound complex that gave the city its original name. The St. Louis portion of the complex, the 26 structures that stood on the Missouri side, exist only in the early 19th century accounts, in the survey documents, in the letters of a German archaeologist who watched the demolition and could not stop it, and in the absence of the things that should be there and are not. That absence is worth examining as carefully as any artifact. Several of the smaller mounds were on elevated ground that would not have been required for railroad yards or industrial facilities for decades after the demolition. Some of them were removed before there was even a plan for what would be built in their place. The demolition ran ahead of the need, and that is what makes it look less like urban development and more like erasure. If you needed the land, you would demolish the mounds that were directly in the way and leave the others for later. Instead, the city of St. Louis demolished all 26 in a 15-year window, with a thoroughness that left nothing standing above grade. The precision of the destruction mirrors the precision of the construction. 26 structures, 0 remaining, 100% demolition, in 15 years. That is not development, that is a project. The question the Tartarian researchers insist on asking is whether the project of demolition was as organized and as specifically motivated as the project of construction. Whether the people who cleared the St. Louis mounds in the 1860s knew exactly what they were clearing, and cleared it anyway because what it represented was incompatible with the story they were building the new America on top of, a story in which the continent had been empty when the Europeans arrived, a story in which the American project was one of creation rather than inheritance, a story in which the new cities were not built on top of old ones but built from nothing, from wilderness, from the raw material of an unsettled continent. The 26 mounds of St. Louis make that story impossible. As long as they stood, as long as people could walk around them and measure them and read the accounts of men who compared them to Philadelphia, the story of the empty continent could not hold. The mounds were evidence of prior occupation, evidence of prior sophistication, evidence of prior civilization, by any definition of that word that does not require the civilization in question to be European. And so the mounds came down, and the story of the empty continent was built on top of them. And the city that rose in their place was called a triumph of American progress, and celebrated at a World Fair 35 years after the last monument was levelled. What was actually under those mounds we will now never fully know. The stone crypts are gone. The bones are gone. The stratified deposits that could have told us how long the site had been occupied are gone. What remains is a name, Mound City. A name that St. Louis used to carry, that appears in early documents and then quietly disappears from the record as the city builds its new identity over the old ground. A name that tells you exactly what was there if you know enough to ask why it stopped being used. 26 structures, levelled in 15 years, not one preserved, not one protected, not one left as a marker of what had stood there. The most spectacular earthwork complex in the history of North American urban archaeology, demolished to grade and filled into the foundations of a railroad city as the United States was constructing the physical infrastructure of a continental empire and needed the ground it was building on to be as historically simple as possible. That is the story of Mound City, the name that St. Louis used to have, the monuments that made it earn that name, and the 15-year campaign that erased them both so thoroughly that most people alive today have never heard either the name or the story. The mounds are gone, the evidence is gone, but the absence is still there if you know where the mounds stood and you stand in that place and look at what replaced them. Nothing about what is there now explains what was there before. That is exactly the point, because if you look at a railroad yard or a parking structure or a warehouse district, you do not think about what might have stood in that place before. You think about commerce, you think about the present, and you stop asking what a city used to be. What replaces the mound in the long run is not a building or a railroad yard. It is a silence, a specific shaped silence that takes the exact form of the thing that was removed. St. Louis still carries that silence in its geography. It is there in the street named Mound that runs through a neighbourhood that has no mounds. It is there in the river view that shows only flat ground where early travellers described an impressive skyline of earthen towers. It is there in the complete absence of any major monument or museum dedicated to the thing that gave this city its original name. The silence is the evidence. The thoroughness of the erasure is the record. And the speed with which a city that had been called Mound City for the first half of the 19th century stopped being called that in the second half tells you more about what was really happening in St. Louis in the 1860s than any official history has ever been willing to say directly. 26 mounds, gone by 1869, the city built on top of them became one of the most important industrial cities in America within a generation. That is not a coincidence. That is a transaction. A specific, economically motivated, historically consequential transaction in which the physical record of whatever had previously occupied that ground was exchanged deliberately and systematically for the infrastructure of a new American century. The mounds paid for the railroad yards, the ancient paid for the modern. And the deal was struck without the consent of history, which was not consulted on this particular occasion at all.